is the founding director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Today in conversation with Ry Moran of the University of Victoria. Welcome to the program, Ryan.
Thanks for having me on.
I'd really like to start this interview. You have a Métis heritage. You were heavily involved in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, working with His Honor, Maurice Sinclair. How did you get involved?
Well, my direct involvement with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started actually with the very first Truth and Reconciliation Commission that kind of preceded the Maurice Sinclair iteration. I was in Ottawa at an event, and I started talking to some of the early commission members about statement gathering and about some best practices in regards to approaching the collection and preservation of oral history. And we started a bit of a dialogue. I was very interested in helping with the commission at that point. I recognized its profound importance and the transformative nature that it would have on this country for generations to come, I think. So we kind of kept in touch. Of course, that first commission had, some missteps. Later, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission sort of reestablished itself, I began conversations with them. Ultimately, some of those conversations led to some discussions about the various staff roles that they had. And lo and behold, I was packing up out of Victoria, BC here, where I had been living very quickly, moving my entire family, hopping on planes, getting going with the work of Truth and Reconciliation. And that really marked the start of about a 10-year journey of a full-out sprint to try as much as possible to realize the vision given to us by residential school survivors across the country.
You worked very closely with Maurice Sinclair, who is revered in this country for the work that he has done. What was that experience like?
You know, the team that we had at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was incredible. Certainly the advice, guidance, wisdom, leadership of the commissioners is without parallel, I think. I think we're fortunate in that the team was very united in a sense of purpose and a deep understanding of why we were doing the work. We were doing this work to honor survivors, and we weren't doing it on their behalf, but we were doing it really to honor the vision that had been given to us and to, as much as possible, hold this country to account, hold Canadians to account, to learn more, to do better, to realize the histories present amongst our midst. You know, the commission itself also worked with a survivors circle, again, filled with incredible people, friends of mine today that have had such an indelible impact on my life, taught me so much. Hundreds and hundreds of health supports across this country as well that have done incredibly important work supporting residential school survivors and their families as they've gone through the various processes. So, what a gift to be part of this team. What a humbling opportunity to be part of this team, to stand in the shadow of people like Maurice Sinclair and Commissioner Wilden Littlechild and Marie Wilson. It's just, it's been an incredible journey and one I wouldn't trade for the world.
The work was based out of the University of Manitoba. Out of that came the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, the commission itself was based out of Winnipeg. That was, a very conscious decision made by the commissioners of the TRC to move it out of that sort of Ottawa vortex even sometimes. That can kind of happen. I think there's a lot of reasons that was a wise decision. Winnipeg's a city with the largest Indigenous population in the country. There's lots of residential schools right proximate there. And from a purely logistical perspective, it's right in the middle of the country. And as a national commission, there was a lot of travel involved and a lot of outreach to a lot of different communities. So that geographic center made it a very good location to work out of. That also was a very important starting place for the commission as well. That's where we held the first national event, where the first of what would in turn be 8 sacred fires were lit. And that first fire was lit right at the Forks in Winnipeg, the joining of the Assiniboine and Red Rivers, marking the start really of the major national events and substantive national hearings that the commission was holding. So the commission was headquartered in Winnipeg. Of course, we worked across the country. And then when it was time to establish the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, we sought expressions of interest from a variety of organizations across the country. Ultimately, it was the University of Manitoba and its partners that were given the responsibility of hosting the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and that's where that organization continues to live, work, and thrive to this day.
You're the founding director of that association. You've now moved on to the University of Victoria. But what should Canadians know about what that center does and is all about?
The center is actually an extremely important place in this country. Again, if you return to the words of the commissioners and to the words of people like Senator Murray Sinclair, they'll say that Canada is in need of a new national memory, because we know that the national memory that we've traded amongst ourselves has been insufficient to this date. It is a national memory that has failed to include the voices of Indigenous peoples. It has failed to include the histories of residential schools, and quite honestly, many other groups that deserve recognition and deserve a rightful voice within Canadian history and Canadian society to this day. So the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is intended to be a foundational and significant contributing mechanism to ensure that the memory of the residential schools is never forgotten, that Canadians always have the opportunity to learn more when they are ready to. It is a continuous recognition of the strength and courage and bravery of residential school survivors, while also on a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute basis, serving as a sentinel against ongoing human rights violations and as a testament to the failures of Canada's human rights record in the past. So it's a very, very important organization. The work of the National Center is going to continue for decades to come. There's still a lot of work to do in order to get records back out into the hands of communities and additional public education work. Since my departure, I've been so heartened to see the really exceptional work that the NCTR continues to do, and it's going to continue to play a very important role in this country for decades to come, if not generations.
We've touched on a little bit, much of your work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was speaking to survivors of residential schools, and I want to just bring back a quotation from an opinion piece that you wrote a few years ago that I read, and you wrote, "Perhaps the most egregious of these policies involved the residential schools that eliminated the rights of Indigenous parents to raise their own children. Through the residential schools, Canada authorized state-sponsored child abduction while simultaneously preventing parents from having a meaningful relationship with their children. Children were cut off from their languages and traditional names while being renamed as numbers and taught to speak and think like Western Europeans." When I read that, it makes you wonder, what is the Canada that I know? You obviously wrote this with tremendous emotion and passion. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, just earlier today, I was involved in a conversation with somebody who's just trying to wrap their mind around the recent discovery of children's remains in now many, many locations across this country. And they were saying how they had an opportunity to listen to some of the sharing circles that the TRC held and continue to be accessible through the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And they said, I wish every Canadian had to listen to at least 3 hours of those sharing circles, because while they're not easy to listen to, they're very powerful, and you cannot help but be moved emotionally, and you cannot help but see the injustices of this country laid bare. And I think, my journey through all of this work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the National Center has been one that has been so emotional. It's been so moving, so impactful. I am certainly forever changed by virtue of this work, and I would say that I'm forever changed in a good way, because I think the blinders about what Canada is and what it has been have been firmly removed from my eyes. And that is the point that we have to reach as a Canadian society. I mean, Canada is a country that has many positive aspects to its history, but those positive aspects do not and cannot outweigh a very serious and full look at our collective human rights record. And we have to, as individual Canadian citizens, come to fully understand what transpired in the residential schools, come to understand how the 60s scoop is interrelated with that, come to understand how the child welfare system today is continuing to fail Indigenous children, understand how this is all interrelated with the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and healthcare and well-being, how this all relates back to very racist and oppressive notions that have been imported into this country about Indigenous peoples, how the doctrine of discovery and the idea that this is newfound land in a way continue to persist. We have a lot of work to do still as a country, and there's a lot to know. And you know, I think what is so horrific about our history is how we did choose to, you know, so intentionally sever or attempt to sever the bonds between parents and children. It is a symbol of just how far Canada inserted itself into the lives of Indigenous peoples and how little regard they showed for those most sacred of all bonds, the bonds between parents and children, and the inherent rights of parents to raise their children in a manner that they see fit. So we have a difficult history. We still have a lot of work to do still moving forward, but you know, I remain hopeful, and I remain very hopeful and committed to this work, and I believe firmly that we can overcome this history and that we can find new pathways based on respect and reciprocity and human rights that will help us collectively navigate out of this.
Ry, you recorded more than 7,000, it's an extraordinary number, of testimonials, of statements from residential school survivors. That's a lot to take in, given some of the circumstances of these schools.
Yeah, it is a lot to take in, and I certainly wasn't alone in doing that work. I mean, we had teams of statement gatherers out there working on this. We had teams of health support workers working on this. We had the commissioners sitting right on the front lines of the hearings. We had members of the Survivors Circle sitting in sharing circles. We had members of the Inuit Subcommission working hard up in the north. This was a massive collective effort, literally involving thousands of people. You know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a very, very big organization. The statements that we heard were oftentimes very hard to listen to. They were full, certainly, of emotion, but of very harrowing accounts. But that's the truth, you know, that is the truth in the Truth Commission. And it was so exceptionally important that that truth came out. It remains so exceptionally important that that truth continues to permeate our public discourse, and that Canadians provide themselves with the opportunity to sit with that truth. We have to hear from residential school survivors. We have to hear from Indigenous peoples. We have to hear from those voices. And whether or not it's comfortable or not is beside the point. It is the truth of what has occurred. And taken en masse, we know that, you know, there's a lot of hard, difficult histories that we have to still reconcile ourselves collectively with. Fundamentally, I think what is the consistent takeaway from all of this is that survivors did nothing wrong. Survivors did nothing wrong. The exceptional takeaway is that a great wrong was done to communities. A great wrong was done to parents. A great wrong was done to those children through ignoring their inherent human rights. their inherent rights to self-determination, their inherent rights to be a child, their inherent rights to enjoy childhood. That great wrong is what Canadians have to understand and what we have to work our way through. And the process of reconciliation is one that is as fundamentally and deeply enmeshed in a process of national healing, wherein we understand the harms and we understand the strengths and we understand the patterns of abuse that have been created, and then work very diligently to repair those harms and say collectively that we will never forget and that never again will these mistakes be repeated.
We're speaking with Ry Moran, the founding director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. We'll be back right after this. On September 30th, Canada will recognize for the first time National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Some of you will recall that is also Orange Shirt Day, which is a reminder of Canada's residential school tragedy and the victims of residential schools and the survivors. Speaking with Ry Moran, the National Founding Director of the National Truth and Reconciliation Center. Those dates are quite significant. September is a tough month for Indigenous communities because of the residential school history. The federal holiday that has been brought in, and holiday doesn't seem like the right word, but the National Day, the recognition. How important is this? It's one of the calls to action that came out of the TNR Commission.
Yeah, it's a very important piece of the collective puzzle, I think, that we're trying to put together as a country to ensure that this ongoing work of truth and reconciliation continues into the future. You know, you can think about this in a way of assembling kind of the infrastructure that's necessary to allow this country to remain accountable and responsible for its past and its present and its future. The National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is a very powerful opportunity for us to take pause, to reflect on what has happened, to honor residential school survivors and their families, to reflect on the lives lost and the futures erased, and simultaneously cast our gaze forward in determination with even a fierce determination to overcome the challenges that we will encounter and to continue on this path, this hard work of decolonization and reconciliation that's so important. You know, the National Day ties into other very important initiatives outlined in the TRC's calls to action around responsibilities and accountabilities that both, you know, governments and we individually we have. So monuments in the national capital and each provincial and territorial capital. The National Student Memorial Register as a means of remembering, a national heritage designation strategy to determine what should happen with the residential school sites. The National Council on Reconciliation to ensure that we continue to stay the course and hold ourselves collectively to account and issue an annual report to the people of Canada. Some of these calls to action have not yet been implemented, but they're all very, very important, and they're mutually reinforcing, and they're all intended to help ensure that reconciliation isn't just a passing fad, but something that fundamentally transforms how we see ourselves in relationship in this country.
You have some visual reminders of a topic that you are passionate about, given your work with Truth and Reconciliation. There's an orange shirt hanging behind you, as well as a blanket. Tell us about those.
Yeah, I think, first of all, you know, these are up on my wall, not as tokens, not as art, but as fundamental reminders of the responsibilities and even accountabilities and teachings, I think, that have embodied so much of the work that I've been so fortunate to do. The blanket was made very early in our journey as the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. It's a star blanket. And if you can kind of see on the outside, there's actually people holding hands around the outside. But in the middle, there's 4 eagles coming together. And that spirit of working together in ceremony, really in following the teachings of the land or being connected with the land itself, are very, very important with this. And if you ever happen to visit the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, you'll see a great big huge version of this hanging on the wall, right above a very important quote by a survivor by the name of Edmund Matatawaban that speaks about principles of justice in the Cree language, and how justice is about listening, being listened to by somebody compassionate and fair, and your needs being taken seriously. And I think about those words so often as I think about the cries that have sounded by so many communities, but certainly the cries that have sounded from Indigenous communities for so long for justice that haven't been listened to. This blanket just reminds me to listen, to always listen more, to listen harder, to listen deeper, to not ignore when people ask for help, to try as best as possible to help. And of course, the orange shirt reminds me of, just all of the children that are still here today, will be here tomorrow, but also that have been with us in the past. The color orange was really given to this country by Phyllis Webstad and her own journey through residential schools. If you're not familiar with Phyllis Webstad and her story, she's a very, very brave survivor who attended a residential school in Williams Lake, had her beautiful orange shirt taken away from her on the first day of school, but has taken that negative experience and turned it into an incredible, really grassroots movement across the country, wherein people wear orange to show their support for residential school survivors, show their support for truth and reconciliation. And again, for this one, it just reminds me of responsibilities. And this particular shirt was made for me on the day that we really shared out the National Student Memorial Register, which was a very important call to action issued by the TRC, and reminds me of that ceremony. It reminds me of the words that were spoken on that day. It reminds me of all the ceremonies that went on before that. And I don't know, I suppose these things are just daily calls to action for me to just do whatever I can do to keep ensuring this work continues, as best as possible.
I watched an interview that you did shortly after the first discovery of an unmarked grave in Kamloops at a former residential school, and of course there have been several since then. And you answered the question essentially by saying, we knew from the testimony that you were receiving during the commissions, but it didn't come out until the commission's work had finished as far as issuing the 94 calls to action. Why?
Yeah, the story of unmarked graves and the story of children that never returned home from the residential schools has been with us as a country for decades now, honestly. Just as the story about the injustice of the residential schools has been around for a very long period of time too. You can look at, headlines and newspaper coverage from the 60s and 70s, it's certainly through the 80s, about what was happening in these residential schools. And the history has been present. Canadians just have not been paying attention, and they haven't been caring enough, frankly. No different than, the boil water advisories that have existed in communities for so long, the absolutely unjust tuberculosis rates in many areas of the high north, mercury poisoning in grassy narrows, MMIWG. We have to care more. We have to listen more. We have to take these human rights injustices much more seriously as a country. And we have to understand that the inequality, this inherent inequality based along, whether or not you're Indigenous or not, is fundamentally unjust, and is frankly not what Canada should be about, or arguably was intended to be about. It's we have a lot of work to do here still, and I think what I do take heart in, though, is that Canadians really have heard. They really have heard what has happened very clearly over this past summer. And I think, we can take pause to acknowledge that there's strength in that there's, an increase in our collective level of awareness and understanding as a result of a lot of public education work and a lot of very brave people speaking out for a very long period of time. And I think while we can celebrate that, I think we also have to recognize that we're still, as a nation, and arguably individually, very early in our collective learning journey too. So there's a lot more that we need to listen to, and a lot more that we need to understand in regards to the histories of Indigenous people, the knowledge of Indigenous peoples, languages of Indigenous peoples. Um, we're on a very dynamic journey together as a nation, and we got a ways to go yet.
We don't have a lot of time left, so I could ask a lot more questions, Ry, but I think I'd just ask you for a final thought just on some advice that you would give to Canadians who do not have an Indigenous background and how they can respond to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and also the residential school tragedy.
Yeah. I think there's lots of different ways that people can respond. One, recognize that there are really good organizations across this country doing exceptionally important work and have been doing this work for a very long period of time, oftentimes without a lot of support. So as Canadians, you can support these organizations by making donations to these groups. So, there's been a lot that have been discussed, but there's organizations working on education like Inspire. There's the National Center. There's the UBC Indian Residential Schools Dialogue Center. There's the Shingwak Center. There's the Woodlands Cultural Institute. They're all working on residential school stuff. There's communities like Muskowgan that are and Long Plains trying to preserve their residential school sites. There's organizations like the Indian Residential School Survivor Society that are providing critically important frontline service. There are language immersion camps. There are language immersion programs across this country that all need support. You can make these issues an election issue right now. We're smack dab in the middle of an election right now. You should be asking your prospective candidates and the political parties what their plan is for reconciliation, what their plan is for the 94 calls to action. The report of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. These are very, very important solutions that have been put forward after great consideration and a lot of thought. And they ought to be in this election cycle right now. You can also learn more. And there has been just an incredible flourishing of Indigenous writers, filmmakers, musicians. There are, countless resources out there now. You can go to the University of Victoria's website. You can take a look at, say, even the little guide that we have on Every Child Matters. And if you're looking for more information on what to read and maybe what to interact with. And we're just one example of many institutions here locally where I am, Greater Victoria Public Library, again, UBC, National Center. I mean, all of these organizations have great lists of books and films to take a look at. Listen, follow Indigenous thought leaders. I mean, Jesse Wente, Ryan McMahon, Cindy Blackstock. The list goes on in terms of Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond out here on the coast. There are so many great voices that you can be following on Twitter, on social media, on podcasts. Get informed, get involved, stand up for injustice, understand that, Canada's human rights record is woefully in need of additional work, and lean into that. Human rights are everybody's business. Indigenous rights are actually everybody's business as well, because they're founded in fundamental human rights principles. Get involved. Don't be a bystander. Speak up when you see racism. Speak up when you see injustice. And learn as much as you possibly can.
Well, thank you for those words of advice, Ry. A lot packed into that. It's been great talking to you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on.
Ry Moran is the founding director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Your TV.